Good morning, everybody. I wanted to make this video with the intent of kicking you off for what we're calling creation translation number 3. So far in creation translation number 1, you looked at some of the details of something called protein synthesis, which involves transcription and translation. In creation translation 2, I had you listen to a 14-minute podcast from a podcast called Radiolab, which is also called creation translation. What I want to do is prime you up for what I'm going to ask you to do with creation translation number 3, right? So part of that assignment that I had you guys do yesterday is I wanted you to ask 3 questions that ultimately came from listening to the creation translation podcast. So you had these 3 big questions, right? What I want to make sure that we understand is, or at least what I want to talk about today to get you ready, is what the process of science is, and also why we use things that aren't necessarily true or exactly the way things are to help us understand ideas in science. And this is illustrated right here on this slide, okay? These 3 models should look familiar to you at this point, and these are all structures of DNA. Over to the far left, there's a model. This is a model of DNA. Here is a model of DNA in the middle. And here's a model of DNA to the right. And what I'd ask you to consider if we were doing this together is I would say, well, what do you think each of these 3 models is trying to convey? What idea are they trying to communicate to the person that's actually looking at the model, right? Clearly, the one over to the left is showing you some of the biochemistry, some of the details. And to me, really what this model is emphasizing is how hydrogen bonds are formed in between the bases in DNA. It's also showing you some of the atoms that are present in DNA. Over here, I think what this model is showing is sort of the general shape or structure or the natural conformation of DNA, which is a double helix. And it's showing you each of these colored balls that you guys can see here as an atom. It might also be how these atoms interact. And this one over here to the right is showing you, I think, the general structure of DNA, but also like how the base pairing sort of works and which base pairs match up. And this one seems to be the most simple, right? So here's the sugar phosphate backbone, which in this one is shown as just a blue line. Over here, it's shown with some red dots and some other atoms. And over here, it's actually shown with the phosphate group and the sugars. So when you think about this, right, all 3 of these models are correct. But all 3 of these models are different and they're also lying. So which are the ones that we actually look at? And I think that idea can be very confusing in science. And what we have to understand is sometimes when we're looking at models, like these 3 things are models, it's because we're trying to communicate an idea. Sometimes reality isn't very helpful to our understanding. We need to develop models, and models are developed in science through very careful and thoughtful experimentation. In order to add detail to a model, it must be evidence-based, and it has to be confirmed by experimentation, which means that there's some very elaborate experiments that have been done in order to determine the structure. And now what we get to do is build on that knowledge from what we can understand, right? So sometimes the details aren't incredibly necessary for our understanding, but I'd always implore you guys to search for evidence-based, credible answers to your questions. And that's ultimately what we're going to do today, right? So what I want to show you here, actually, is what does DNA actually look like? That's what DNA actually looks like. So this is something called an electron micrograph, right? What this thing does is it uses electrons instead of light, which we talked about when we were using microscopes, in order to see very, very small structures. This is what DNA actually looks like. Now, if we were to just look at this, are we going to learn anything about how base pairs are made or what the backbone is made out of? Or are we going to be able to emphasize any of the details that would allow us to do biotechnology? And guys, the answer to that question is no. But this is reality. So our models are used as a way to help us understand very important details about the world. Fundamentally, the process of science isn't focused on very much in schools. Like the actual process isn't. But science is the pursuit of truth through experiment that collects empirical evidence to form these models or evidence-based conclusions. There are no guesses. Technology also plays a really big role in this, right? So as we increase the power of our tools to extend our senses, We can ask better and deeper questions, which means we get more and more detail with our models. The truth comes into higher and higher resolution, right? So when you guys are looking at some of the answers to these questions, like how do we know whether or not translation is a real thing? It's because there are so many experiments that have confirmed this process of translation. It's about the process of science working. And because that's not focused on very much in schools, it's a question that a lot of science teachers get very consistently is, how do we know all this? It's through experimentation. But one thing I want to caution you on is it doesn't mean that you need to be cynical about this information and reject it. I sort of make it analogous to, I cannot dunk a basketball, but I can watch LeBron dunk a basketball. And that's because LeBron is incredibly skilled and has taken years and years and years and years to do what he does really, really well. And just because I can't necessarily do the things that he does doesn't mean that I reject basketball. I think it's the same thing with scientists, right? Like, scientists are incredibly well trained to do what they do. And the information that they get is a self-correcting process. And what I mean by that is scientists can have an idea. They make mistakes because they're human. The scientists are. What's great about science is that if it doesn't agree with their experiment, no matter how much they love their idea, the scientist loves their idea, if it does not agree with their data, it's wrong. So the things that we have in science, they progress throughout time, and we get higher and higher resolutions because we increase our technology and we ask better questions because we have models. But the things that we have in textbooks are pretty solid. Like, they've been figured out. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It does not mean that they're perfect. But I think it's a wrong idea to be cynical and to reject these ideas just because we aren't as well trained as maybe some other people who actually do this for a living are. So I want to give you the preface of that. Now, what you're going to do in today's assignment is I want you to take, out of those 3 questions that you asked from listening to the podcast yesterday, I want you to find what you find to be the most interesting, engaging question that you asked. What's the most interesting question that you asked? And I want you to pick that question, and I want you to try to find an answer. I want you to find an answer to the question that you asked and that you're saying is the most interesting one. And next week, I'm going to have you guys share one slide, and that one slide is going to be the answer to your question. For now, today, it doesn't need to be done. You'll have some time in class next week to work on this a little bit. We'll be with each other, and I'll help you out. Next week, I want you to bring your computers with you to class. Make sure that you do that because you're going to have a little bit of time to research. I also want you to research today, and you're going to try to find some answers to those questions. So let me recap, and then you'll also see it there the assignment is there on Canvas. You're going to try to put together a slide that's going to answer a question that's really interesting that was ultimately came from listening to the Creation Translation podcast. And I think that's a really good use of our time because you guys get to look into a question that you're interested in. So hopefully that primes you up a little bit with what you're doing today. I hope you guys have a great weekend once you're done doing your research today. I'll see you next week in class. See you next week, guys.